Professor Greenberg, nice to see you and welcome to our Identity podcast.
Nice to see you, and thank you for inviting me.
No, it's definitely a pleasure, and I'm sure that we'll have plenty of interesting things to talk about today. So first of all, actually, what I'd like to bring up is that just before we started today's session, I was sort of reflecting, and I remembered I actually met you in my hometown of Cetinje in 2019, if I'm not mistaken.
That's right, yeah. Just before the pandemic that we didn't know was coming.
Who would have known, right?
Right, yeah, the whole world changed.
Indeed it did. But it does sort of bring back some really nice memories for me, in particular with the Filološki dani that was held in Cetinje with many academics gathering. What was a fine sort of weather spell in Cetinje in September 2019, and as you said, I'm actually, in hindsight, I'm very glad that I made that trip because of what sort of ensued. Because
I am too. Yeah. It was a pleasure meeting there, and I met a number of other colleagues, and it's remained not just a lot of pleasant memories, but a lot of collaboration has come out of that as well.
That's right. So I guess obviously there's, when it comes to the Balkans and Montenegro being no exception, there's plenty to say when it comes to language-related matters. And as many people will know, you've dedicated a lot of time in your life and in your professional career towards research in this sort of space. And I believe there is plenty to be said on a range of topics in relation to this. But in particular, given that identity is the focal topic of this podcast, I believe that it's worthwhile sort of focusing on that rather complex relationship between language and identity.
Mm-hmm.
And I've actually come across some of your publications where you discussed sociolinguistic sort of processes and matters in the Balkans, also with regard to Montenegro, where you actually touch on to this topic. So perhaps maybe to get us started, what can we say to sort of bring this topic closer to the viewers and give them a snapshot of what this entails when it comes to this relationship between language and identity?
Well, I can give you a kind of idiosyncratic view, just kind of how I got into the whole thing as well. I got interested in Slavic studies myself in the 1970s when I started going to UCLA, and they had a very strong Slavic program there. And there was just something there that was calling to me when I was just developing intellectually. I myself came from a East European background, but as many people in the U.S. Of my age are, where it was their great grandparents who came around the turn of the 19th, 20th century. Much of the original identity and the old country memories have been lost over the generations, and really they were actively erased because there was a great deal of emphasis on the melting pot, the American melting pot.
That's right.
And becoming part of a larger, newer entity and erasing differences from the past that people wanted to forget for various reasons, mostly poverty. I think my family was no exception. And so they were looking for a fresh start in America, which was the land of opportunities. But growing up in Southern California, in Los Angeles specifically, as I did, was also this kind of very strange kind of fake culture. Let's put it that way.
Right.
There's Hollywood. I was born in Hollywood just coincidentally, and grew up going to the movies. That was the main form of entertainment. Every now and then you'd actually run into somebody who was an actor or something, because we didn't happen every day, but that was part of the background in LA in those days. and everything just seemed kind of fake. And I was really curious about, how did I get here? And so I started kind of looking for my own roots. There were vague hints. Oh, we came from Russia. Your great grandparents spoke Russian, but beyond that, we don't know anything. So I enrolled in Russian when I got into college at UCLA, and from there went on to many other things. And I guess that was kind of my search for my own identity. But what I ended up doing was searching for other people's identities, because the actual work you end up doing when you get into something like Slavic linguistics, and at that time the real emphasis was on historical linguistics and dialectology. When you get into the weeds, you start piecing together these puzzles of the past, and I just found it intrinsically exciting. But that also, for a practitioner of historical linguistics and dialectology, then leads you into these questions of how do languages and groups form, and specifically in Eastern European context, and former Yugoslavia and its constituent republics were no exception. In fact, probably in some ways primary examples of this. Language and dialect features and linguists played an outsized role in forming the basis for modern identities. And so, as I started doing the work and also traveled more frequently to the region, collaborating with people, you get drawn into these various narratives. So after I had spent some time in my student days, my formative years, I was able to take trips to live and learn language in the Soviet Union and Hungary and Czechoslovakia. And eventually I made it to Yugoslavia, and really fell in love with everything that I found there. Very specifically, I fell in love with my future wife, whom I met in Czechoslovakia, actually. And she's still with me. She's in the house elsewhere working at the moment.
Good to know.
and we raised children who are bicultural, bilingual, and so in a way, my work became also my life, and so the identity I was searching for ended up becoming a new kind of hybrid identity, personally. But in the course of all of this, huge transitions were taking place. We happened to have been in Yugoslavia at the moment that Slovenia declared its independence and the war started. And we had been living there before. I'd been there on a Fulbright fellowship for 2 years before that. And so we were seeing these rising nationalisms happening, and being a linguist and being involved in research institutions where I was meeting with linguists all the time, you could see that they were major players in how these national identity issues were being formed. And the stage was being set for what was going to come next after the country broke up. And it was I was kind of oblivious at the time working in Yugoslavia. I still thought this structure was going to last forever until about the last year or so, when it became obvious that things were pulling apart. But language played a big role. So concretely in Slovenia, there was the famous trial of the four. This is before your time. I don't know if you remember or know these details, Jovan.
Mm-hmm.
But the language thing was forefronted. So the supposedly or contra-revolutionary provocateurs were put on trial, and one of the big issues was within their own republic, they were denied the right to their trial in their own language, which is Slovene. And so the trial was held in what was then called Serbo-Croatian. And so this set up a kind of no-win situation. So, it kind of galvanized the streets in Slovenia, and Slovenes, felt this as an affront to their rights, and they saw it as a case of hegemony from the center. imposing segregation on them against their constitutional rights to use their own language, particularly in a trial when your rights to freedom are under challenge. So,
Right.
yeah, it became front and center. So the theoretical stuff I was working on, the dialectological stuff, just putting together the pieces of puzzle and trying to figure out things. The script kind of flipped on me, and I realized, well, there's lots of things going on in the present day with the kind of reshaping of the linguistic landscape with the breakup of Yugoslavia.
Yeah, I think it became clear quite quickly that, when it became common knowledge that Yugoslavia was not going to last, you could certainly see some twists and turns with regard to language pretty much right away. And I think it's also interesting how it shows you the complexity of what's essentially a mammoth task that's been attempted to somehow get all those different ethnicities and linguistic groups to agree and to find some common ground and move forward. And how essentially, yes, as I said, when it was clear that there was no longer going to be possible, I believe that that was immediately an opportunity for the things to change in a way that suited those very people that were looking to, make their next move, so to speak, on what would remain from the ruins of Yugoslavia. And I think what's important to what's interesting for me to mention here is that, as you've pointed out in some of your publications, especially with regard to ex-Yugoslavia, we have this high degree of mutual intelligibility among different dialects and languages, which, again, it creates a rather large gray area. And, any group within that space, if they happen to be in a position of power, they can rather easily exercise their power to their advantage, and engage in assimilationist sort of policies and practices. And to me, it's quite fascinating to see how many sort of back and forth movements we've had in that way since the early 90s.
Yeah, and as a historical linguist and somebody who kind of looks at the longer stretch of time too, it kind of seems ironic to me that things worked out the way they did when you think about what the impetus for Yugoslavia was in the first place. This idea of emancipation from non-Slavic colonial powers, Austro-Hungary and the Ottomans. The idea of unifying the South Slavs in some really amazingly imaginative ways, such as with the Illyrian movement, which was experiments that was kind of hinting towards the future Yugoslavia, or even before that, the idea of a kind of brotherhood of reading, a culture of reading other people's literatures and languages and getting to know, kind of something that would have foreshadowed a kind of Switzerland arrangement where everybody kind of knows each other's language enough to function with them, and kind of mutual respect for them. So that was the Jan Kolar vision of Pan-Slavism. And yet, when you fast forward to the 1990s, it's a very different kind of thing, and there's far more competition than cooperation, which was at the outset of the project of emancipation. And so, basically, brothers in language are trying to emancipate themselves from themselves. So it's a kind of historical irony.
It is. It is indeed.
And I was thinking too, in anticipation of our conversation, everybody knows that standardization of languages is a construct. It's not something that happens naturally. They're made for a certain purpose, and there's a kind of interesting parallel here in the way that humans behave in the biological world. There's an interesting book I was reading a few years ago before the pandemic called "Against the Grain," and it shows how humans, when they're before they became urban, were landscaping the earth to even before agriculture, to try to maximize the number of calories they can get out of the environment. And
Right.
I think standardization is kind of that same kind of landscaping, kind of corralling things into a
That's
shape
right.
that are manageable, so that you can
Yeah.
work it to your best advantage. And
That's right.
I think that's what nation states are trying to do. They're trying to, create polities that work in a certain way, but use the material that they're given to start with.
Absolutely right.
Something like that. Linguistic landscape. And so, when I think about the Montenegrin problem, it's obvious that Montenegrins understand their neighbors perfectly well. So it's not a question of, is there really a separate language? Bosnian, Serbian, and Croatian and Montenegrin are the same language in terms of the material from which they're built. But I think it's a kind of natural process to want to standardize your language to fit in with the community that you envision. And it's the Benedict Anderson view of the imagined community. From this border to that border, I expect to speak more or less the same way as all those other people, because I can imagine what they're like down on the southern border and the northern border, because they're basically like me and not like those people over there. And
that's right.
And that's the European model, but not a pan-European model. I mean, we have the case of Switzerland, where we have unrelated or not closely related languages that make a nation. And so there's nothing that says you must define your country based on a single language. Bilingualism, trilingualism, quadrilingualism can work, and why not? It's a matter of agreement, collaboration, planning.
That's right.
Yeah, and
Go
ahead.
No, I was just going to sort of make a comment on, and compare how these contexts differ so greatly. I mean, when I think of New Zealand, for example, it's a country of migrants and sort of a melting pot, just like the US is, but on obviously a smaller scale. And I think we have to take into account that, for example, New Zealand, probably because of where it is located geographically and other factors, it doesn't necessarily have to worry about any threats, so to speak. So the country, the national identity, the language, none of that is under any threat.
But I would challenge you there. I mean, what about Maori?
I was going to get to that.
Okay.
And there's something very interesting. I'll actually comment on that. I'm glad you brought it up. So the way things work now is that you'd have, most of the migrants who come to New Zealand, they're free to sort of preserve their background and their cultural identities and linguistics, etc. But in some way, I think there's this undercurrent that leads them towards assimilation, and that's more or less no one really pushes you that way. But I think that's kind of, if you look at what's good for you, you would probably look to develop English to a certain standard so that you can live a better life in New Zealand.
Right.
You raised a really good point about Maori, and what's interesting and what I'm glad to say is that New Zealand has really looked at itself critically and at its past, and it has really tried to kind of make steps that will correct some of the practices that were previously done with regard to Maori language, where I've mentioned this in one of my previous podcasts. Maori language was pretty much persecuted. Maori people weren't allowed to speak it in schools in 60s and 70s. Whereas now, my daughter comes back from a preschool and she sings Maori songs, and it's being integrated in everyday language, and people are genuinely embracing it. So depends how you look at this, and I often reflect on this. But it's maybe sort of how should I say this? I mean, it's a touchy subject, but what I'd like to see is for the Maori population to be going in the right direction, not just sort of the policy, sort of top-down policy being implemented to empower Maori language, while the very Maori population still isn't doing that great in many ways, and unfortunately overrepresented in some of the wrong statistics. So in a way, I would say it's all going in the right direction, and I think it's a really good example of how countries, if they want to take responsibility, they can actually be reasonable and sensible, and ensure that no one is sort of left behind in that way. So that's kind of the update on Maori that I'm kind of happy to report on.
Yeah, I was very impressed when I met you and also our colleague Robert Greenberg. I was very happy to hear about how Maori is making a comeback, and it's being embraced by not just the Maori community, but also it's an important symbol of national identity, and at the same time, it helps to preserve a language that otherwise might have been moribund. And we can also see the work that somebody like Gilad Zuckerman is doing with the Aboriginal languages in Australia, not so far away. And it's good to see that there's a way to pull back from the brink.
Definitely.
Yeah, but you mentioned this idea about socioeconomic advantage. When I teach my American students about language policy, we take various case studies. So former Yugoslavia is one, but the Soviet Union is a really interesting case study for this too, because it's inherited a huge empire with 130 plus languages spoken in it, and the original impetus at the beginning of the Soviet Union after the revolution was to bring all of these languages into a sphere where they would have kind of equal status. And so using this kind of European model of nation state has a national language. And so the original Leninist policy was called Korenizatsiya, or to create parallel thought, but in each of the languages. So everyone would think in terms of socialism, but express themselves in terms of their national language. And then World War II came along, and Stalin, and flipped the whole thing on its head. And the post-Stalin and post-World War II language policy was completely different. And it was oddly a much more democratic policy, which basically gave families choice over how they wanted their children schooled. And of course, once you do that, the choice is going to be that which will make my child most competitive and mobile and successful in the society. And the choice was Russian. And so it ended up having this deleterious effect, completely undoing the impulses to preserve and elevate languages that were part and parcel of the immediate post-revolutionary period. And so you end up having homogenization in favor of Russian, much the way that in Tsarist Russia was trying to homogenize its language situation and make it a rational one language state, if at all possible. That was a very complex process. I'm obviously oversimplifying it, but democratic forces can be deleterious to language projects.
They definitely can be.
What I'm saying, and so this assimilationist impulse that we're talking about is, that's it's driven by socioeconomic necessity, let's say.
it definitely can be one of the factors. And I think, again, if you make that comparison between the States or New Zealand and, for example, ex-Yugoslavia or Russia, certainly there's a lot more tension when you compare. And again, what I'm trying to say is, as you and I commented when we spoke recently, I think in New Zealand and in the States, there is a bottom-up approach to language. Whereas in these other countries, you see a top-down approach,
very much, yeah,
as dictated by policy, etc., and as probably a byproduct of political processes. And I think that's not to be undervalued in a sense. So it is kind of a case of whichever group is the most powerful will try to assert itself, and perhaps if they're powerful enough, they will convince others that it's probably best to align with this sort of, with what is being sort of put forth by these powerful groups. And I think, again, as I mentioned, we briefly discussed before the session the ECRML, the European Charter for Regional and Minority Languages. Also very interesting to look at how what the European Union hoped to achieve with that, and how extremely complex it is to promote and protect languages that are under threat in light of these, realities that you actually have in different countries, and it's so diverse as well. There are many examples of where, you can argue, yes, the intentions were right. You were trying to empower this group of people by allowing, by holding the state responsible to, allow education in that language, to allow for them to preserve their culture, etc. But the reality is that probably within, in their everyday lives, they have no incentive to do this, when assimilation is probably the preferred way. That will get you the job, that will get you, to the right circles of friends, etc. And I think those things can't be ignored.
Yeah, and they're both pushes and pulls. And so I'm thinking about some work that an anthropological linguist colleague of mine did in Eastern Germany with the Serbian language in Lusatia. And there it's been a long known story that, the socioeconomic advantage goes to the generation that becomes completely monolingual in German, because there are really no job opportunities connected with knowing your Sorbian heritage. It's strictly a matter of folklore and heritage. And then when you try to, people in the community, usually elders, trying to inculcate the younger generation with a sense of duty to preserve the language, it can backfire. And the effect is, I don't want to be told how I'm supposed to speak. And, you're correcting my grammar. Isn't it good enough that I use some of your language? And then they don't want to speak at all. And so, this kind of heavy-handed top-down approach can really work against you, particularly in cases where languages are truly endangered, like Sorbian, for example. So it was an interesting, eye-opening experience that I had hearing the field reports from this anthropologist about, how the very people trying to preserve the language are the ones hastening its disuse.
Right. I was
and
just
then
going to
there are
mention.
also. Go ahead, please.
No, please go ahead. I can. Yeah.
I'll save it. I've got more things to talk about for later.
Okay. Cool. I was just going to bring up. You talk about in one of your publications. You mentioned this famous sort of phrase that a language is a dialect with an army, which is a funny one. I think that's worth unpacking to an extent, especially with regard to the ex-Yugoslav context.
Yeah, well, that's a famous dictum that is attributed to Max Weinreich, who was a Russian Yiddishist working at Columbia University in the 40s and 50s and beyond. And he was... it's not certain that he was actually the person who edited it. It may have been one of his students. In fact, it might have been Joshua Fishman. Right. There's some speculation about this. Doesn't matter. But the idea is, and this dictum gets often repeated in the literature. It's how do you tell the difference between a dialect and a language? And it seems to boil down to the fact that there's some sort of institution that stands behind language, and so it's this idea of top-downedness that you were talking about, and that's kind of the European model for how language standardization works. Making something an official language means you've got institutions, and you probably have an army and a navy, because that's what a nation state has.
Right.
Although it becomes a problem for Hungary, because then, or even Serbia, because they don't have a navy, so then they don't have language if you use that definition too strict.
Right. Can work both ways sometimes.
Can work both ways, yeah. But there's a famous article about what does it take to make a standard language. Paul Garvin, who comes out of the Prague School theory, and he kind of typologizes different kinds of language policies, and it's really a kind of Central European specialty to kind of push the standardization to the top degree, the nth degree, and to have a top-down model. Whereas, as we were discussing, the U.S. model, for example, is completely bottom-up. It probably comes as a surprise to many people, but we don't have an official language in the United States. English is not it.
Wow.
And most people would say, if you ask them on the street, they would say, of course, English is the official language. Well, it turns out it's not. And there is no constitutional right to use English, nor is it demanded of you that you use English. In fact, many languages can be used and are used. And even the form of it is basically a matter of continuous negotiation. So the American Heritage Dictionary, for better or worse, is our model for the American lexicon. It's based on a continuously rotating panel of people who are good at writing, journalists and writers and people who appear on TV and that kind of thing. And it's kind of constantly in flux, but there is no Academy of American Language that tells Americans how they're supposed to speak. It's Podogovoru.
That's so different compared to Europe, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's just completely different approach.
Yeah, and it works. As I say, democracy can have a deleterious effect. So the effect is, we actually had languages that could have competed for national language. German was widely spoken in the United States up until World War I, until it became deprecated and people started hiding their German language. But if you go back to newspapers in the end of the 19th century, there was a great deal of publication in German. The state that I live in and the next state over, Missouri, were very heavily German speaking. And even today you have low German speaking populations still left in the state. All kinds of place names left over. So there's an Olmütz, Kansas, which is the German name of Olomouc. So there's a German Bohemian community that's still left there. They're now mostly English speaking, but there's still some traces of German left. But it could have gone many other ways. It just wasn't part of what went into becoming American. It's just de facto is that Americans mostly speak English and use it as the dominant language, but it's not a constitutional guaranteed obligation or right.
I think you're quite right, and what you said earlier about the various push and pull forces that affect what happens to language and languages in a certain context. And I think to an extent we all almost we're programmed in a way to protect the way that we speak, and we want to elevate it to a certain standard, and we want to see it thrive. And that's all fair enough, obviously. And I can give you an example. And I remember a few years back going to Montenegro for a holiday, and I was with my dad, and we ran into a friend of his we are originally from the village of Njeguši.
Mhm.
So we were passing through and we stopped to have a drink, and he ran into someone that he knew from a while ago. And the person joined us and started speaking with us. And I can tell you that I savored that moment so much when I saw them two engage in conversation.
Mhm.
And to me, that was a performance. That was a performance of an identity,
Mhm.
where language is an unbelievably important part.
Mhm.
And the way that people speak in Njeguši is quite different, obviously,
Mhm.
as you know. There's a lot of variations around. Even
Mhm.
Montenegro is quite small, and
Yeah.
10, 20 kilometers up or down, you've got completely different influences, etc. But that particular moment I'll never forget. And I remember thinking, God, I wish we could do something to preserve this.
Mhm.
And, as obviously, because you're a part of that, you want it to live on, you want it to flourish in some way.
Mhm.
But, again, maybe a conclusion that I sort of always come to when I consider these topics is that if you have enough people who do creative things with that language, or
Mhm.
maybe who engage in research and teaching, who elevate that language to a new
Mhm.
level through work and through
Mhm.
skill, that's probably the best way. And again, that's where if you widen sort of that scope a bit more, you realize, okay, well, then that means if you have a stable country, if you have a strong
Mhm.
economy, if you have a good education system, then you're in a good position to look after your language in a way that is useful.
Mhm.
And I believe it's fair to say, possibly, with regard to a lot of areas in Europe, if you're just simply relying on top-down policy, you and you're lacking all these other parts, you're probably going to struggle,
Mhm.
and you're not in a good position.
Yeah.
Again, coupled with maybe push forces that are trying to assimilate you, that it's a very, very complex sort of web.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know the situation in Montenegro as intimately as I'd like to. I mean, I've savored the moments I've been there too, and of course I know the material through literature and my contacts there, but I don't have the privilege of living it as fully as you do, being a native from there. But it seems to me, just observing some of the things I've seen in and about Montenegro, there are good reasons to be optimistic. I'm thinking of things like the comedy troupe Books of Knjige.
Yeah,
And I think, they use authentic language, and
that's right.
they're poking fun at themselves, but at the same time, they're inviting the audience to identify with not just authentic humor and ways of being, but also with authentic language, and that seems to me a kind of a very natural way to develop a pride of identity that organically ties language into the project without coming from above and saying you must speak this way in order to
That's right. That's right.
to be a proper patriot. That kind
That's right.
of that kind of thing is going to backfire more times than not.
Most probably. And
And
yeah,
I was just gonna say that there's a great deal of creativity, not just in comedy, but this kind of lighthearted as well as very creative group of people who write poetry and prose and do theater with authentic language, and those are extremely important parts that work kind of the way things work here, which is there's an organic push towards the language rather than a top-down kind of stick to
that's right.
to to push people into using the language.
Yeah, and I mean, look, there's something that I recently sort of put forth as an argument that I quite like, and that's I believe Njegoš is an unbelievably important figure for Montenegro when it comes to Montenegrin language.
Mhm.
And it seems to me that a massive chance has sort of gone begging to
Mhm.
use his work, um, to assert and promote the Montenegrin language, because as I believe is a very reasonable argument to state that the way that Gorski Vijenac is written is he used authentic language. And again, it always reminds me of Dante and the Divine Comedy, and how we know Dante's courage to use what he referred to as the vulgar language of his time to the protest of the elites at the time, who basically told him, what are you doing? And nonetheless, he used his skill and his creativity to promote that common language and basically set the foundations for what the Italian language is today. So in a way, what I'm saying, I believe that it's a real shame that, and I'm aware why it hasn't quite gone that way for Montenegrin when it comes to Njegoš, because it's hard to reconcile the sort of the language processes with the politics and the ideologies that are very complex in the Balkans. And probably I'll be free to say Njegoš probably was had other things to worry about, and he was more he was sort of concerned about the political sort of context of his time, and the some of the goals and projections that he was sort of pushing, which probably prevented him from saying, actually, I'm writing in my own language here. So that's something that chance is still there in a way. Obviously, it's language that belongs to the time when it was used, but nonetheless, it's a great example of how, again, reinforcing the same point. When someone who's skilled enough does something truly magical with a language, that's all that a language needs.
That's certainly the model in with many European languages. I think of Prešeren for the Slovenes, or Pushkin for Russian, and Njegoš is for the Montenegrins. It's that was the pinnacle of the usage of the language at a time when it was forming its identity as a nation. And so the other things he was concerned about, as you mentioned, was actually making a nation out of tribal disunity, and so that was quite an achievement in itself. And yet he had this additional literary achievement as well that's endured the test of time. Yet, as you say, it's problematic because it's been appropriated by others as well, right? So
that's
others
exactly right.
Others would like to see him as their poet, but it's kind of hard to argue with the geography of it. It seems pretty Montenegro-centered as far as I can see.
Yes, that's exactly right. And I think,
again, is not someplace else.
Yes, exactly right. And one other thing that I have to mention is that perhaps those very people who are looking to appropriate Njegoš and argue that he's others more than ours, which is, I can't quite understand how that works, while at the same time criticizing the Montenegrin language as being a dialect and being undesirable and being a lower status, and basically saying, what are you guys doing? You're arguing this is a language. So I don't understand how quite that works. There's no way to reconcile this. To say, yes, we like Njegoš and we like his ideology because it suits us, but we're just going to ignore the fact that he actually did use a language which we needed to translate in order to understand it. So again, I think it's just part of very complex political processes, but nonetheless, this needs to be sort of, this argument needs to be put in place in a way.
I think so, yeah. Narratives of deprecation and shaming are I think are at play here, and I think that's a shame, frankly. There's no reason that any linguistic material can't be made into a standard language, and so Montenegrin is no exception to that. I spent part of the spring in Japan, and I was visiting the Okinawan island of Okinawa, which is its own entire kingdom, and it had its own language of its own empire at some point, and became deprecated basically by force at some point. People were forced to stop using it and shamed into using it in favor of Japanese. So these things can have very tragic outcomes. But what seems obvious, though, is there was nothing intrinsically about the Ryukyuan languages that couldn't make a perfectly good language of a state. It's simply that it got outlawed at a certain point and was replaced and shamed almost out of existence. Still exists. It's marginalized, but you kind of have to fight back against those forces, and you have to do it in kind of clever ways, because simply asserting it isn't enough. It has to be done in some way that's attractive and that has pulls.
That's right.
For people, and not just
right.
not just legislation.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, or charters for that matter. The charters don't necessarily work, as we've been discussing, also outside of our present conversation.
That's right. So you can appreciate the sort of the aims of such initiatives, but you have to look at the reality and say it's very difficult to address these issues top down.
Yeah, but there's, for example, I noticed I try to use the Montenegrin standard where I can. It actually comes fairly naturally because I have this palatalization effect in Californian English. And so adding them in doesn't seem problematic to me. I also don't have any sort of visceral response to using them. It just seems like a nice, consistent code to use. But when I use them, Montenegrins, they congratulate me, of course, for using it, but they're shocked in some way, because it jars with their expectations, because the neutral language is the kind of polished Belgrade-centered accent or something like that, or maybe Sarajevo kind of urban accent, but not with shs and js yet. And I think if we can imagine a future in which the shs and js and js and chs occur without shocking people and without they're just used in everyday discourse. I can imagine 5-10 years hence that we could get to that point. But it's kind of hard to back off of this emotional reaction of it to it and just kind of make it a neutral way of using one's own language.
I think also I'm glad you brought this up, actually, because I'm thinking, being used to this sort of top-down approach, not just in relation to language, but in many other things, these sort of areas such as the ex-Yugoslavia are quite susceptible to sort of just going along with whatever is being communicated from higher up. And I have an example, again, that is quite interesting, what you just mentioned. Watching Montenegrin TV channels, I sometimes think this is a person from Belgrade. And I think what we can't underestimate is the remnants of the Yugoslav era, where there was a handful of channels and people mainly spoke that way. So I think that's really difficult to weed out. And we are seeing more like people, as you said, who are, comfortable to go on TV and speak as they would normally do at home, using the sh and j and whatnot. But I think there's a lot of work to be done in that space, because I think there are many others who realize that perhaps there's still this dominant sort of view that if you speak in that way, perhaps what you're saying is not really to be regarded, is not as valuable or as serious as someone who sort of aligns with that sort of ideology.
It really struck me when I saw this documentary film on Montenegrin that I actually appeared in. But of course, when you record a segment of it, you don't see the whole thing until later. And I saw, the frame narrative is entirely in this very neutral 4-accent system with none of the secondary jotovanja.
Yeah.
And, it kind of negates the entire message of the film, in the sense that, the really serious language of narrative really belongs to this language that's outside of Montenegro, and the subject is almost like a curiosity within that. And so it struck me that until that can be overcome, it would be hard to accept the narrow version of Montenegrin as a neutral standard.
Yes,
and I don't know how to solve that. It's maybe a matter of time or attitude shifting.
I think it's a very complex issue, and I have to bring up Njegoš, where I have to say he didn't really lead by example, because if he did, in a sense that he used authentic language, but if we observe the fact that he never referred to it, he maybe there's experts who know more than me in this, but I'm just sort of putting out there this argument that I believe he should have done more to say, yes, this is actually our language, and to be brave enough to say this is Montenegrin language, because today would be a lot easier for us to draw on that and say, hey, why do we need to take a back seat? And it doesn't really align with this whole, if you think about it, this whole narrative of Montenegrins as people who love freedom and who want to be free. Well, look, if we want to be free, then why not promote your own language? Why would you sort of take a step back and say, no, this is not my language. Oh, actually, I align with something else. So in that sense, for me, it doesn't really stack up. So in a way, I think those are some of the things that go against us at this point. That is for people who are trying to merely say, hey, we are free to say this is the language that we speak. This is how we've always spoken. This is how we speak at home. And we're never going to be ashamed. And we're going to use it no matter where, we might be. So I think if we can communicate that to enough people that that's the way forward, that would be very desirable. However, again, as we mentioned, a lot of assimilationist sort of pressures are always present. And that's not to be underestimated. And however, though, I have to say, what people need to realize is that a huge part of Montenegrin identity is sort of based on resistance. So, as you said earlier, it'll probably any sort of pressures of this kind will create a counter effect. And I have to give another example in relation to Japan, what you mentioned earlier. And I lived in Korea for 4 years, and I became aware of many of the intricacies there, because, as you know, Japan, there was an occupation of Korea that lasted. It was quite a brutal occupation. And Koreans will often tell you that during that time, the sheer destruction that they experienced during that occupation meant that their conclusion was that their language was their final refuge. And I find that quite powerful. And there's actually some nice texts on this and how they secretly created a dictionary. They risked their lives during the occupation to preserve their language and create it. And I mean, look, Korea today is, very proud sort of nation, and, they know who they are. And I quite enjoyed being there and witnessing this. And in a way, I believe Montenegro has a lot of challenges, and we just have to be persistent and promote what is ours. And I think there's no shame in that whatsoever.
No, of course not.
So I think that's kind of where, again, where I stand, at least when it comes to this topic. And I think, Marc, unless you have anything else to add, we could probably wrap up for this session.
Sounds good, Jovan. It was delightful talking to you. Thank you very much for having me on your show.
Thank you very much.
Keep up the good work.
Thank you, and I look forward to having you again.
Okay, sounds good.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.